Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series, Societal Psychosis, a meta-analysis of systems that make it difficult to determine and connect with reality. Today is our second webinar entitled The White Supremacist State Through the Racial Triangulation of Black, Asian, and White Communities. This webinar is being sponsored by the Society of Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPSE. My name is Tina Lee, and I am chair-elect of SPSE's Graduate Student Committee. I'm also a fourth-year PhD student in counseling psychology at Teachers College, Columbia University.
And my name is Obi Ageli Uguru. I go by Obi. I am the current chair of SPSE's Graduate Student Committee. I am a fifth-year student, PhD student in clinical psychology at Fuller School of Psychology in Pasadena. I'd like to welcome you all and want you to definitely check out SPSE's website for more information and updates related to the Graduate Student Committee, our current projects, and programming related to our upcoming conference in August. So, Stephanie as well.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Stephanie. I am on GSC as well in policy applied work focus. And I just wanted to quickly introduce, I'm putting in the chat now, an upcoming form for our producing policy webinar. So as you're attending this webinar and engaging with it, I want you to keep in mind that we have this policy webinar coming up over the summer, where you'll be taught to create a policy brief, resolution, fact sheet, or infographic on either this topic, criminal justice, immigration, and really this is a hands-on component for concrete advocacy tools. So if you keep in mind what you've learned and you're interested in having a policy focus based on what you've learned, please complete this form and we'll follow up after the webinar with this information as well. Thanks, everyone.
So we'll be taking audience questions during this webinar, so you can submit your questions in the chat box while we introduce our panelists. We will also try to answer the submitted questions from the registration page.
So Daphne Penn is an incoming provost postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology and Population Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on the roots of racial inequality in America and the politics of ethno-racial stratification within the context of demographic change. Her co-edited volume, The Dark Side of Reform, The Potential of Contemporary Public Policy for Racial Equity, is currently under contract with Lexington Books. She is also writing her first solo authored book, The American Dream Deferred, which explores the politics of immigration-related demographic change in a historic African-American high school in the American South. Dr. Penn's research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the Center for American Political Studies, the Immigration Initiative at Harvard, and the UC Davis Center for Poverty Research. Welcome, Dr. Penn.
Thank you for inviting me.
Joe Fegan is Distinguished Professor and LSC McFadden Professor in Sociology at Texas A&M University. He has conducted internationally recognized research on American racism, sexism, and political economy issues. He has written or co-written 74 scholarly books and over 200 articles. His books include Systematic Racism, White Party, White Government, Latinos Facing Racism, How Blacks Built America, Elite White Men Ruling, Racist America, Rethinking Diversity Frameworks in Higher Education, and The White Racial Frame. He is a recipient of a 2012 Soka Gake International USA Social Justice Award, the 2013 American Association for Affirmative Action's Arthur Fletcher Lifetime Achievement Award, and 3 major American Sociological Association Awards, W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award, the Cox Johnson Fraser Award, and the Public Understanding of Sociology Award. He has also been the past president of the American Sociological Association. Welcome, Dr. Fegan.
Thank you.
Claire Jean Kim is Professor of Political Science and Asian American Studies. Her first book, Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black-Korean Conflict in New York City, was a recipient of the American Political Science Association Ralph Bunche Award for the Best Book on Ethnic and Cultural Pluralism, and a Best Book Award from the Organized Section on Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. Her second book, Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, was a recipient of a Best Book Award from the American Political Science Association. Dr. Kim is co-editor of a special issue of American Quarterly entitled Species, Race, Sex. Her popular writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times and The Nation. She is interviewed by the media on current events relating to race, social movements, animals, and ecology. She just finished writing her new book entitled Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Thanks for having me.
We are so excited to have these scholars with us today. Please join us in giving a warm welcome to all of our panelists.
So let's dive right in. This question is for each of you. In your opinion, which major historical event has been pivotal in shaping the current racial landscape of America?
Oh, okay. I will start us off. So I teach a class on the roots of racialized inequality at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And one period that I really like to focus on is Reconstruction. I think it is really important for our understanding of contemporary inequality. Historian Eric Foner describes Reconstruction as an incomplete social revolution. So we think about slavery, we think about the civil rights movement. And although Lincoln didn't necessarily have a specific plan for Reconstruction prior to his assassination, scholars have generally argued that it did have the potentially to radically change the course of history in terms of Black political, social, and economic life. However, following Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson empowered Southern legislators and defeated Confederates to enact Black codes and essentially develop a new system of slavery, or neo-slavery, as some people call. Once Reconstruction was abandoned in 1877, we see the rise of Jim Crow racism. And in an Atlantic article, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed wrote an article titled, "What if Reconstruction Hadn't Failed?" And in that article, she states that our deeply rooted problems of today might be closer to resolution had we, quote, rewrote the scripts on race relations during the 19th century instead of delaying it until the 1950s and the 1960s with the civil rights movement. So if folks are, interested in learning more about Reconstruction, of course, W.E. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Eric Foner's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, and Slavery by Another Name, I would definitely recommend those.
Joe, did you want to respond?
Yes, I think one could come up with at least 100 answers to that question. Two jump out for me. The first would be the summer in 1787 when those 55 white guys built the foundation, the legal foundation for this country in the US Constitutional Convention. We still live under that Constitution made substantially by slaveholders. And I guess we're the only so-called advanced nation which lives under a Constitution made by slaveholders. And they built into that Constitution a sustained legal framework to protect slavery. Primarily the enslavement of African Americans, although some Native Americans were also enslaved. 60% of US history, 60%, was slavery. More than half our history. And we're still living with the effect of that Constitution, especially its Electoral College, which was put in there to enhance the political power of the Southern slaveholders by counting under the 3/5 clause enslaved workers in their states. And without the Electoral College, we would not have had Donald Trump. We would not have had the insurrection on January 6th. We would not have the threats to democracy right now. And I would echo in a way what Dr. Penn said. I would add to Reconstruction what happened just before it. When about 200,000 African Americans volunteered for Mr. Lincoln's army in 1863 to fight against that systemic racism, that enslavement system built into this country. It was the first successful Black uprising in this country. It helped bring down the slavery system, and it set in play what Dr. Penn talked about in Reconstruction. And ultimately, it was the first Black Lives Matter movement. So it too is relevant for today.
So my answer really dovetails with both of your answers. I think I want to say the Haitian Revolution, because I think one could make a case for the importance of the Haitian Revolution for our history, but I will say slavery, just the period of slavery, and I'm going to leave that open-ended because there are a lot of disagreements about whether it's ended. But I would say the period of slavery, racial slavery in this country, which lasted for hundreds of years, created a society and a state that is structured around anti-Blackness. And anti-Blackness meaning the phobic avoidance or hatred of Blackness. And that is an inheritance from slavery, as many scholars in Black studies have argued so brilliantly. That's an inheritance from slavery, and that's our inheritance, and that's our living reality today. So some other scholars in Black studies have pointed out the structural and functional continuities among slavery, Jim Crow, ghettoization, and mass incarceration, right? So we know that all of these major institutions are linked together, and there's a reason that Saidiya Hartman uses the phrase, coined the phrase, the afterlife of slavery, because there's as she writes in her book, Scenes of Subjection, emancipation, so-called, was not really emancipation, right? It was sort of a transition, as she puts it, from one mode of racial subjection to another for freed people. So if slavery didn't end in emancipation, when did it end, right? And that sort of raises a question we can all struggle to answer, but certainly the afterlife of slavery, that concept, alerts us to all of the cultural, social, economic, political, psychological, and other psychic continuities from the period of slavery to today. So I think this is why the 1619 Project by the New York Times has become such a controversial issue, right? Because if we teach honestly about the subject of slavery, it has the potential to upend the society. It has a potential to create an impetus for fundamental or radical change. And there are a lot of people invested in the status quo. And by this, I mean, how things are under racial capitalism, to use Cedric Robinson's phrase, who don't want that kind of change. So there's a big pushback against the 1619 Project, and also the banning of so-called critical race theory in American schools.
Thank you all for your answers. This is also for everyone, for the group. Most Americans are not aware of the depths of systematic racism in our society. How can we begin addressing it in the context of education and academia?
Well, I can start that answer. Clearly, US education is a catastrophic failure. Our educational system has failed to teach the basic truths about our history. And the attack on systemic racism, the attack on any kind of critical analysis of our racist system proves that, I think. And the only solution to it is a very aggressive anti-racist educational system from cradle to grave, to replace the mythology. We live under a whole set of white myths about this country, and that system has to deconstruct all those white myths.
So I think Dr. Kim's last answer kind of spoke to this with the discussion about critical race theory. And when I think about this debate, sometimes I'm like, how did critical race theory become like the one thing that people are focusing on? And when you think about it, it's much deeper than that. It's not critical race theory. That's just putting a name to a broader history, or a broader set or a broader discussion about history that certain people just do not want to deal with because of its implication for the status quo. I think about, I've seen a lot of people who talk about how it wasn't until the college and they had learned, certain things about history and what it did for, their own personal growth, as well as their, interest in seeing social justice enacted in society more broadly. But you think about the fact that maybe, 30% or 32% of Americans will generally earn a bachelor's degree. I think maybe 50% complete some college. Our K-12 system is the one institution that the vast majority, if not all of us, go through. And so if we can prevent that knowledge from making its way into the minds of all of our, children, then we can essentially control the narrative related to, history. One of the principles of, my course on the racial history of the United States is that, in order to atone for the past, we have to know it and we have to acknowledge it. And if you don't know the past, if you don't know history, then you can just ignore it. You can pretend like none of it ever happened and that it doesn't still impact our systems and institutions today.
Yeah, I think I've been very alarmed by the attacks on critical race theory and the 1619 Project. I remember years ago reading that in Japan, post-war Japan, the textbooks were edited to be untruthful, that the textbooks denied, the sex slavery that had happened during World War II. They denied Japanese imperialist activities during World War II and prior to World War II. So, and I thought that's the mark of a fascist regime. That's the mark of an authoritarian regime. And so to hear about the way that the right wing in this country, that the way they've set their sights on American education, I mean, this isn't a new thing, but this is just the latest, right, example of it. And that they want to repress that history that we have all, everyone who's tuning in today and speaking today is so concerned about. That's alarming. And I think this speaks to the larger illness that we see in our democracy. But I think I'm not optimistic that we'll ever come up with a great curriculum that we can sort of enact or implement, district by district or state by state, because education is so politicized, because it's such a site of political struggle. I feel whatever powers that be exist will always have a greater say in what gets taught in almost every institution. That's why I think these sort of spaces that the Civil Rights Movement created or the Black Panther Party created, right, these alternative schools, freedom schools or liberation schools, where the truth was actually taught against, right, against the grain, against the narrative being taught in almost every other institutional space. I still feel like that's where true history will need to be taught.
Can I add one more thing to that? I feel like when we talk about like anti-racist education, at the heart of our desire to, create anti-racist curriculum is this belief that if we change hearts and minds, then everything will change. And I think we have to remind ourselves that, if it was just a matter of changing hearts and minds, some of our greatest progressive movements may have never happened. So we have to focus on policy just as much as we focus on, a particular curriculum or any type of anti-bias training, which, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that those things can increase knowledge, but they might not necessarily have the same long-term impact that changing policy or changing institutions can have. So you know, although it can be kind of disheartening for us to think about like, oh, you know, we don't have uh, you know, bodies of knowledge in our K-12 system, we can't think about that in isolation. We can change policies even before we change hearts and minds, and that's important to focus on as well.
Thank you so much for all of your great answers. The next question, even with a growing diverse population, studies have shown that racial attitudes among the public have not changed significantly since the civil rights era. Some argue that interracial contact has worsened race relations, while others argue that it has mitigated it. What are your thoughts around this debate?
I'll start with this one. So I guess I think the language of this question is a little bit alarming to me because it reminds me of Plessy v. Ferguson, where the court talks about trying to prevent the commingling of the races, right? So, you know, the question is, does interracial contact, you know, promote racial division or racial togetherness? I don't think that's the relevant question. I think the relevant question is how do we build a just society? How do we build a racially just society? And whether or not, you know, I don't think it makes sense to put the question of what happens to race relations first, because that was the excuse that people in the South, white leaders in the South used for, and the Supreme Court during Plessy used for centuries to try to deny Black people rights of any kind. So, right, that it would be divisive if you brought people together. It would, you know, that race relations were better during slavery than they were after slavery, right? So one can twist those kinds of words and concepts in a million different ways. I think the question should always be the ethical question and the justice question that should be foregrounded.
I think Dr. Kim's comments are right on in thinking, you know, moving past like the idea of contact and thinking about the broader picture. And I even think even if we do focus on, you know, the idea of contact is not just about, you know, putting people in the same places. I think it's really important to think about the quality and the context of contact. So I think about it within the context of schools. After Brown v. Board of Education, yes, contact increased. Like if you actually think about the results of Brown v. Board of Education, I think there's research that shows like right after Brown, that Black students were like less segregated than they are today. But what did that contact mean for their social, emotional well-being, for their academic outcomes? And so, yeah, I do think we have to think about the quality and what, like the end goal, the why and what is happening within the context of contact. I think that can answer questions about like the debate on like the increasing or improving race relations or not, but I also think it can think about broader questions about equity and justice, as Dr. Kim said.
I think we also need to add to this good set of points that we live in a hierarchical system. And not all whites matter to the same degree in creating our racist system and as points of attack and deconstructing the racist system. The folks who rule us at the top, what I call the elite white male dominance system, almost never get studied in social science research. And their power decisions The actions they take are the critical ones that have shaped our racist, sexist, classist system from the beginning, and that shape it today. And I think in addition to thinking about how ordinary Americans should be relating to each other and dealing with racism, we also need to focus on those elite white men at the top of the society who almost never get called out and analyzed for their systemic racism, for their racist framework, for their dominant white racial frame, and indeed for the actions they take that keep creating and recreating the system. Those mostly mindless whites who attacked the Capitol on January 6th were there because they watched things like Fox News. And I haven't seen anybody call out the Murdochs behind Fox News as major creators and sustainers of our systemic racism today. Are the Koch brothers who were behind the election of Donald Trump. So I think we do need to focus on ordinary whites, but I also think we need to focus on the white guys there behind the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, really running the system.
Thank you all for your responses. This next question again is for the group. With the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, the call for increased community safety has increased, but one unintentional effect may be the over-policing and criminalization of other communities of color. What solutions do you have to increase Asian American and Pacific Islanders' safety, and at the same time ensure that these solutions do not increase the power of the carceral state or heteropatriarchal solutions that will continue to maintain systems of oppression?
Are we taking turns going first?
It looks like it.
Well, I just did an article with one of our Asian graduate students on the anti-Asian hate crimes. And we analyzed a set of data that had been created by some Asian American organizations on the West Coast. And one of the things that you quickly see in the data is it's part of an anti-Asian framing more generally. Anti-Asian hate crimes are not new. They've been part of racist attacks by whites on Americans of color and Asian Americans in particular for generations now. And the whites who articulated in those attacks the stereotypes and images of Asian America were articulating very old anti-Asian imagery, stereotypes, framing. There's much that needs to be done, both in education and in the policy that Dr. Penn is talking about.
So I think this is an important question, and I just wrote a piece on the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and I wanted us to think about it in relation to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which is stuck in the Senate right now, may not make it out, and also in relation to the March 2021 report released by an international commission of human rights experts calling systematic racist police violence against Black people in the US a crime against humanity. This was released just a few months before the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was passed. And I think it's very dramatic that international human rights report got almost no US media or governmental attention, but the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act passed with huge margins in the House, and in the Senate it passed 94-1. So I am a political scientist, but I rarely count actual votes, but this was a very striking vote, 94-1. And so the question is why, right? Why the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act is passing like that. And this, I think, relates to a much larger story that I'm trying to cover in my new book about why it is that when the US state is being called out by Black critique, by the Black freedom struggle, whether it's at home or abroad or both, why, at those moments when it's being called out, does it turn to do something nice for Asian Americans? This is a pattern that we have seen historically, and it raises the question, who gets what out of the state favoring Asian Americans over Black people? This is really what I'm trying to address in my book. But the way that you raise the question really points us to look at a slightly different angle, which is what do Asian Americans do when they're trying to protect themselves from anti-Asian harassment and violence? Do they have another option, right, than pushing for this Hate Crimes Act, which many lobbied for, which was introduced by 2 Asian American legislators, but which really doubles down on the carceral state, as you suggested, both by having more things count as hate crimes, or rather expedited hate crime review, and anything named as a hate crime is going to get a longer sentence. And also it gives more funding to law enforcement to come up with anti-hate crime programming, right? So this is clearly like beefing up the carceral state. And yes, Asian Americans have a choice. There are many leftist and progressive Asian Americans who criticized this act and said we should not be undertaking an act or any project which is at direct odds with Black Lives Matter. Many people in Black Lives Matter are calling for defunding the police. They're calling for abolition of the prison system. They have successfully put those 2 things on the agenda in a way that they have not been on the agenda till now. And it's a shame for Asian Americans to be doing anything to try to take them off of the agenda, to try to weaken those struggles. So I think I don't think hate crimes legislation does anything for Asian Americans either. I don't think there's any proof that calling something a hate crime or doubling down on the carceral state makes Asian Americans safer. What will make Asian Americans safer is when we live in a society where, injury and privilege are not organized around race. And the best way to get there historically and today is the Black freedom struggle. So I think Asian Americans, as many younger Asian Americans have already figured out, need to be doing what they can to support the Black freedom struggle. To me, that's the best alternative.
Dr. Kim, I love that you framed your answer in relation to how legislative efforts to combat anti-Asian violence, how it should be in alignment with maybe broader goals around like Black Lives Matter and, anti-incarceration. Because when I reflected on this question, to me, I was like, for me, it kind of assumed that communities of color played like the major or, the biggest or a really big role in rising anti-Asian violence. And, although the data on the subject is imperfect, a recent report that came from the University of Michigan's Violent Hate Project, they looked at, I think, 2020 hate crimes that have been covered in the news, and of the 184 incidents where the race of the perpetrator had been identified, the vast majority, 90%, were white and 5% were Black. And I assume the other 5% could have been, from, a community of color. And so for me, I felt like the discussion about anti-Asian violence, a lot of it in the media has centered like, the idea of Black-Asian conflict. And I feel like that narrative kind of takes attention away from the real problem, which is white supremacy. There's a 2020 study on prejudice within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it indicated that white Christian nationalism has been at the heart of racist and xenophobic views since the spread of COVID-19. So I do think it is important to consider the unintended consequences of a carceral approach, especially if it is not in alignment with Black Asian solidarity in relation to like Black Lives Matters platforms. But I think it's also important to note that public safety is not possible if we don't dismantle white supremacy. It's not possible for anyone, Black, Asian, anyone, Latinx, anyone.
So
I
this
have
actually,
one data point in, Tina, if it's okay. One data point from our data on anti-Asian hate crimes is most of the hate crimes were carried out by white men. The threats and the violence itself, and most of the targets, majority of the targets were Asian American women. So in our data set for the last year, it's gendered as well, both in who attacks and who got attacked.
That aligns with the Michigan data as well.
right, well, this question is specifically for Dr. Kim. In your new book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, you critique your original theory. Sorry, my cat is here. I was not expecting that.
Yeah.
You critique your original theory of racial triangulation and propose a new framework for thinking about the positionality of Asian Americans, partly based on Lewis Gordon's argument that the American racial order is structured by the principle, be white, and above all, don't be Black. Can you speak more about your new theory and how it's similar or different to racial triangulation?
Okay, thanks for the question. Thanks for teeing it up so I could talk about my new book. So it is hopefully coming out sometime early next year. So the ethnic studies in general and comparative race studies focuses a lot on white supremacy and has since, the middle of the 20th century at least. And I think white supremacy is a very important force in shaping racial politics, but I also want to bring in serious attention to anti-Blackness in my book, which again, I'm taking from especially scholars in Black studies who study Frantz Fanon and his idea of negrophobia, which again, this phobic avoidance and hatred of Blackness and how that structures society, right? It really provides the abjected figure of the Black person, provides the foundation for how humans define themselves, how Americans define themselves, how whites define themselves, et cetera. So if we think of anti-Blackness as a structural force like that, then, and we try to articulate it with white supremacy, then what happens to the story of Asian Americans? Typically, the story of Asian Americans is told as, this is what white people did to Asian people, right? So it's a very binary kind of framework, and they're not, typically scholars are not looking at Black people who were either slaves or freed people or free Blacks in that historical period. So they're just looking at whites and Chinese, for example, in the 1860s or 70s. This is not true of all Asian American scholars, but this is true of the majority. So what happens when we bring anti-Blackness back into the picture? So here I turn to philosopher Lewis Gordon's idea that the US racial order is defined by two principles: be white, but above all, don't be Black. And so really anti-Blackness is the primary principle. And that's what I find in my book, which is a historical study of how the Chinese and their descendants, and Chinese immigrants and their descendants, Japanese immigrants and their descendants, how they got located in the US racial order once they arrived here, and how that has played out over the next century since their arrival. And what I really find is it's the principle of don't be Black. So what I talk about is their not Blackness. How does not Blackness constitute like a boon for Asian immigrants so that they use it to negotiate their way around the American racial order and the capitalist order? So that's essentially what the book is about, that Asian Americans are structurally disadvantaged relative to white people, but they have a clear structural advantage relative to Black people, that they are not white, but above all not Black. And if we rethink Asian American history from this perspective, it really changes the story. I mean, I think there are a lot of dramatic, interesting moments in the book, which are surprising to those of us who have been accustomed to seeing Asian American studies told as a white over Asian story.
Thank you for your responses. Black Lives Matter. This question is for Dr. Kim, I believe.
Oh, I think we're only supposed to get one each, aren't we?
Okay, so this might be for everyone. Black Lives Matter has been one of the few movements in our history which has had a large number of white and BIPOC Americans involved in anti-racism work. Are we uniquely positioned to change our current racial system today due to movements like BLM?
So I would say what has been accomplished over the past, I guess it's been about 7 years, I think, that Black Lives Matter has been around. I think it's been amazing. Um, I feel like it has brought to the forefront for many people. I don't know how they did not know, but it has brought to the forefront for many people that we are not in a post-racial society. And in terms of whether this particular movement puts us in a position to really, create or see change, and I think it's important to really emphasize the importance of, social media campaigns, marches, but also we need change in the courthouse. We need change in the legislatures. I think about like 2009, after Obama was elected, and we saw the rise of like the Tea Party movement. And that movement transitioned into having Donald Trump elected and having a lot of traditional Republican elected officials being out for more right-wing Republican actors. And I think for me, in terms of seeing Black Lives Matter or the momentum around Black Lives Matter creating major change is, I like to see local politics, people getting elected locally. We have to change our state houses. We need more governors, because as we can see, you can have however many senators you want, but if you don't have that majority, or if state houses are doing their own thing, like with schools, as Dr. Kim noted, is, those are run by states. If you don't have state houses, then a lot of times the progress that you want to see will be stifled. And so I'd like to see social media and on the ground marching coupled with more strategic political action in terms of electing people at all levels.
I guess I would say that I think to give earlier periods of struggle credit, I think there have been multiracial efforts in the past. So if you look at like radical Black internationalists in the early 1900s, they have real political ties to activists in Asia, India, Japan, etc. And then in the 1960s, right, the Black Panthers, if you look at Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition, right, it included Asian American groups and other groups of color. So there's always been, there's been in the last century or so, a recognition of the importance of doing that and efforts, Black-led efforts usually to do that. I think that there's been, however, sort of a natural, not natural, but inevitable barrier to that, so that those efforts never grow past a certain point or never last past a certain point. And that's because of the structural discrepancies among these groups. So for example, in my book, I'm really saying one of the reasons that we don't see Asian, Black, or Afro-Asian solidarity in a more robust way or in a more lasting way is that Asian Americans historically, even the very progressive ones, have been reluctant to acknowledge the structural differentiation between themselves and Black people. They've been reluctant to acknowledge they are Asian Americans, no matter how discriminated against. They're living in an anti-Black world. They're pursuing their politics in a world that is fundamentally anti-Black. And so without that sort of really honest recognition, truthful recognition of structural positionality, of the differences in power and status among groups of color, it's very difficult to build lasting solidarity. So I think the good news is, to the degree that we can achieve that kind of truthfulness, it's possible there will be different kinds of political relationships that we can form as communities.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Penn. In your work, you study schools as a microcosm of society. Schools are sometimes absent from broader conversations about intergroup relations and conflict, anti-Blackness, and the reproduction of racial stratification. Why is it important to center education in conversations about these broader social issues? And based on your own research, how are these issues manifested within educational settings?
You just as we discussed earlier, education is our latest battlefield over, racial inequality and the, continuation of racist ideologies. There's often this belief that, schools or education is the great equalizer of the condition of men. That's like a quote from Horace Mann. But it's really important to consider how early life stratification processes, these same processes that play out in, higher education academic settings or play out in the corporate environments, also play out in the school context and not only reflect those same inequalities, but reproduce them in the long term. We think about, tracking in school, in thinking about that, previous conversation about the quote, Black Asian conflict, a lot of the time that has come up within, debates about, affirmative action and the place that African Americans hold within institutional settings. But all of that is one, a reflection of a system that has been created within our broader white supremacist society, with the idea that there are only a certain number of spaces for any given group, and that students from communities of color have to compete for a small slice of the pie, when really we all deserve, an equal share of the pie. And those debates that I feel like, or narratives that are put out conveniently by other people, often take our eyes off that bigger piece of the pie that is occupied or that is often held by the white dominant group. And so I think it is important to think about how the debates in broader society play out in, the classroom or school context, and the way they perpetuate them in broader society. And finally, I'll note is that the people who enter schools to educate our children are the same people who enter voting booths and, do vote for, policies or people who hold certain beliefs. If you looked at the news, there were a number of teachers who faced disciplinary action because they were at the insurrection. And so I think it is really important for us to realize that our children are being educated by people with the very same biases that we know exist in our broader world. And if we don't address them, if we don't take into account the stratification processes that are happening in school, we can never address, the stratification that happens more broadly outside of the K-12 context.
Thank you, Dr. Penn. This will be the last question for all of you. What would the world look like if white supremacy was no longer the architect of our lives?
Well, I don't think it is the architect alone of our lives. I think it is the architect with anti-Blackness of our lives. So if you broaden the question to say, what would it look like if neither white supremacy nor anti-Blackness pertained, then then I think that's the kind of world, right, that people are trying to get to in the Black Lives Matter, in the Black freedom struggle more generally. And one question that comes up for groups like Asian Americans is, you know, how do we think about our own relationship to regimes of private property and policing and prisons? Because we don't have the same relationship as a whole that Black people do to those regimes. So it would be imaginable that, you know, I think some Asian Americans imagine that they can protect, that we can protect ourselves and not worry about Black people. So it's okay if Black people are getting killed continuously by the police because we're not getting killed continuously by the police. And there is a tendency that I'm seeing with Stop Asian Hate to sort of close ranks and say, let's pay attention to what's happening to us. And I think that's a dead end because the illusion, right, is Asian Americans can get themselves free and not worry about Black people. And I think that, you know, Black feminists had it right when they said unless Black women are free, no one will be free. Or when Black women are free, everyone will be free. And, you know, you can extend that to Black trans people and you can extend that in various ways. But the idea that those who are really held at the bottom of society, it's only when they're free that everyone will be free. I think that's a profound truth that other groups, right, the non-white, not Black groups, have to think about and factor into their political struggles. But in terms of what the world would look like, yeah, that's a vision that I see most fleshed out by Black thinkers and activists through the centuries.
Yeah, I think you could also pick points in our history and in world history that would illustrate at least partially what it would look like. Dr. Penn mentioned Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Eras in the South had working class whites, middle class whites, formerly enslaved African Americans, some Asian Americans working together to build a truly democratic Southern political system in many of the states. Black folks were elected to positions they'd never been elected to, and they were supposedly uneducated, but they did fine. Whites came from the North, and Southern whites participated too in supporting movements. People were lynched, but people fought back. I think Dr. Penn is right. We need to foreground things like Reconstruction. And I think Dr. Foner is correct too. It is the Second American Revolution. Or you can look at those Black soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers. And it wasn't the Union Army they were in, it was the US Army that had formerly enslaved Black folks, Black freedmen. The support troops included Black women, other women of color, working class whites. So things like the Civil War and Reconstruction, and today we've got quite a number of anti-racist activist groups. One of the ones that I've helped some is called ASDIC, A-S-D-I-C, Anti-Racism Dialogue Study Groups in Minnesota. And they believe you have to have many workshops, many discussions, many dialogues to begin to deframe that dominant white racial framing of the society. You can't do it in one short course. You can't do it in one workshop. Even the beginning of wisdom on this has to be a systematic deframing of the dominant white racist framing of the society. And there are groups like ASDAC that have made some progress in that regard. It's also a multiracial group.
Kind of building on that answer and going back to Reconstruction, in W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, he talks about how Black people were actually the architects of public education in the South. It was not an idea that was widespread. They did a lot of institution building within the context of oppression and did it really well. There's been a lot of discussion about Black Wall Street. And you think about how communities such as the African American community were able to flourish despite all of that. And just think of what could happen if they were able to flourish, or we were able to flourish outside of a white supremacist system. And beyond that, I guess I can just go a little bit more basic than that. Over the past few years, we've seen a lot of discussion about, while Black. In 2018, I think CNN published a list of, just mundane activities performed by Black people that resulted in them being reported to the police, from not waving while leaving an Airbnb, redeeming a coupon, working as a firefighter, barbecuing at a park. And I think at the most basic level, a world without white supremacy would look like Black people just being able to live our daily lives without the fear of violence and death. We will be able to shop without an associate assuming that our pregnant tummy is merchandise that we're hiding. We could golf at a leisurely pace without the police being called on us for golfing too slow. Or many of us are in an academic setting. We could eat on campus with our lunch, or nap because we're really tired, and not have to worry about violence or police. And so I would say, I don't speak for all Black people, but as one Black person, I think many of us just want to live our lives in peace. And it's very difficult to do that when you are under the threat of white supremacy.
Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing all of your thoughts with us in this hour. That ends our time with our amazing panelists today. And thank you to the audience for attending our second webinar, The White Supremacist State. This webinar is being recorded, so it'll be uploaded on SPICY's website. And we also have an upcoming immigration policy workshop for our third webinar series next month, so please be on the lookout for that. If you are interested in joining the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, you can join our membership at spicy.org, where we have many more events like this happening in the future.